This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm Jamie Bogner. This is episode 246. I am in Lincoln, California today. And sitting across from me is Zack Frasher, co-owner, head brewer for Slice Beer Company. Welcome to the podcast, Zack.
Yep. Thanks, Jamie.
We've been trying to get this podcast. I tried to do this last summer when I had a trip planned out here. You guys were making some waves. We'd clearly written about stuff about you in the past in Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine at a brewery you worked for before this. But then since then you just went and won a gold medal at World Beer Cup recently for a hazy, juicy, strong pale ale. Hey, we've got lots to talk about on this episode. We are going to talk about hops. We're going to talk about West Coast IPA. We're going to talk about juicy, hazy IPA. We're going to talk about the intersection between the two and how, each of those styles are influencing each other. We're going to talk about your approach to hops, your approach to building a base for that allows for this hop expression, all of that fun stuff. Can't wait to talk about more of that. But first, what if you could chill your beer with a more efficient chiller? The answer, G&D chillers, new micro-channel condensers. G&D's micro-channel condensers are highly efficient in hotter regions, use a fraction of the refrigerant over traditional chillers, which provides less opportunity for leaks, along with lower global warming potential. G&D Chillers engineers are committed to green technology design while developing a more energy-efficient chiller for the brewing industry. Contact G&D Chillers today at gdchillers.com. Also, are you ready to brew like a pro? ProBrew has the equipment, systems, and technology to take your brewery to the next level. Check out www.probrew.com for info on patented ProCarb inline carbonation technology, ProFill rotary filling and seaming can fillers, the Alchemator inline alcohol separation system, 7 to 50 barrel brew houses, and more. ProBrew, a subsidiary of Technoblend, now a ProMock brand, offers the craft beer industry innovative solutions to help you brew like a pro. Go to www.probrew.com for more info. Zack, let's talk about your history. Like I said, we first wrote about you at another brewery not too far from here. You're an avid podcast listener. We met up last year at CBC. Well, I should say we met up. We kind of randomly encountered each other at Bierstadt at our kickoff last year.
Drank a little bit of Hellas, and hung out for a while. And
For sure. Yeah. So talk to me about your arc through brewing. What was the thing that got you hooked, and how did you then decide to pursue craft beer and brewing as a career?
Yeah, sure. So I got into beer in general pretty young, back in high school, and I was drinking what I thought was good craft beer back then, like Newcastle Brown and St. Pauli Girl, and,
sure.
But Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. So I always appreciated beer. And then I got into home brewing back in 2008. I had my first daughter back then. She was tiny. I was kind of stay-at-home dad, and I was looking for a hobby to do. So thought about, getting to making beer. Thought it was the coolest thing ever.
She was tiny.
Yeah, well, she was like one.
Oh, okay.
So she was little. So yeah, so
they're all pretty small at that age.
Yeah, so stay-at-home dad.
Sure.
Loved hanging with my daughter, but was bored too. And so
sure.
I think I came across a magazine, and it was like, I think it was like a Mr. Beer kind of kit. And I was like, oh, this would be awesome to make beer.
Right.
I didn't end up doing the Mr. Beer kit. I kind of went a little more into research and got a more nicer equipment, but it was the thought process got the juices flowing to do this hobby. So got into making beer, 2008, avid home brewer, entered a lot of competitions, caught the bug, to really get into it.
Right.
I was probably one of those typical people that I made my first batch of beer and I was like, I want to do this for my career kind of thing. And ended up actually doing it. So, made beer a lot. And then, around 2013, late 2010, early 2011, I met up with the guys from Knee Deep Brewing Company, and they were contract brewing up in Reno, and they were ready to launch out here in Lincoln, actually, at the old Beerman's facility. And so I just kind of bugged them and said, hey, like I'm a relatively accomplished home brewer. I got some like first round NHC medals. I like love this as a hobby. Like, would you let me come and bug you guys? And well, first I asked for a job, and they said, we're not hiring. And so,
Sure.
And so I said, well, can I come like bug you and like just, watch what you do and help out and make beer? And they said, sure. So I came in and, helped on bottling and kegging off beer and milling grain and then brewing. And ultimately it was kind of like a fake internship, for making beer, unofficial. And then I was winning medals at the time as a home brewer, and the brewer owner there said, hey, if you want to make your own beer here, we can rock and roll it. We can put it, in draft. It'll be a 15-barrel batch. And so I got to brew Zack's double IPA and, shoot it out. And back then, 2011, it was just a different world.
Sure.
To me, that was huge. So did that. And then life happened, and I ended up not really working there or being a part of them anymore. But I got, 9 months in of learning a lot of, production, industrial, technical, brewing on that side, which I think is invaluable. Coming as being a home brewer, the first time you see IPA tank, it's like, it's insane. So got my start there in the industrial setting, and then I worked at a homebrew shop for a couple years, and I worked also at Miraz Brewing Company up in El Dorado Hills. And so I put in a couple years at the homebrew shop, still kind of fine tuning my beers, because I felt like I still wanted to go pro in some aspect. And then got the job at Miraz, but I worked under Mike, and so I did all of his beers. Didn't really do my own thing there. So learned about, mix firm at his spot, and, barrel aging, and then classic styles too. And then somewhere in between, when I was at both of those places, because I worked at them in tandem, working like 6 days a week, couple days at Miraz, couple days at the homebrew shop. I met the owners of Moonraker at the time, and he was looking to open a brewery, and he was home brewing, but I think he was more home brewing to have a test kind of pilot system to work on. So kind of hobbyist for him, but I think it was more on the business angle because he was preparing to open. And he came in, and I dealt with him from a customer service perspective, and he, I think we clicked a lot in customer service, and I think he admired what I did in terms of talking about beer and educational aspect about beer for him as a home brewer and business. And then we started talking about business, and he said, well, would you ever want to, come work for me and like be like a head brewer? And I was like, well, that would be awesome. That's kind of like the dream,
Right.
Where I was at the time. So, checked out the facility, empty warehouse, nothing in there, bare bones. We talked, interviewed, got hired, separated from Miraz, and it was the Brewmeister homebrew shop at the time in Roseville. Separated from both of those locations, both of those jobs, and came on to Moonraker as like the founding brewer, first employee. So came in, commissioned the facility, put all the equipment in, developed, all the recipes, all the standard operating procedures, hired all the initial people, hired like my assistant brewer at the time, the first wave of tasting room people. So kind of launched that company to some degree. And, the owners at the time, they didn't know a whole lot about beer from their background. They were business people. And so they did give me creative freedom, which is really cool. And I remember at the time it was, we want to put these beers in bombers and put them in gas stations. And I was like, at the time, so into cans and Hazy IPA. And I'm like trading for these beers, from Hill Farmstead and The Alchemist, back then. And, that was kind of like when that haze craze was really hot on the East Coast. And not much here. And I said, well, hey, how about this? What do you think about if we do, this kind of beer in this format and sell it, directly out of the tasting room? And he looked at me like I was crazy. He's like, what's this guy talking about? We're going to sell like pallets of cans.
Just trust me on this one.
And I was pilot brewing on his system at the time too. And I'm like, and he was really into it. He's like, oh yeah, these hazy beers are rad. This is different, And so, he gave the creative freedom and gave me the trust, and I think the benefits did exceed expectations at some point.
Sure.
We ended up doing fairly well early on. I think especially because there was not much competition for that at the time.
Right.
Up in Northern California, nobody was really doing hazy IPA thing yet. I think even in California in general, the only people I knew that were doing it was like Monkish down south. We're just getting started, and field work was just tapping into it, but they weren't putting it in cans. Alvarado Street was getting into it.
Sure.
So we got this, we caught it at the right time and kind of ran with it. And so I think that really helped sustain, reputation and what we were doing. And so
that's what puts you on our radar. And there's that breakout brewer story on Moonraker from a number of years ago in craft beer and brewing for that same kind of reason. Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that was a Highland Park collab beer that we did for that article.
Nice.
Yeah, it was cool. So did Moonraker,
That's true. There's a recipe from those Moonraker days back.
There is. Yeah.
So subscribers definitely go dig into those archives. Check that out. Shameless plug.
Absolutely. Did Moonraker, put in a good stint there for almost 4 years. And then I had, another opportunity knocking on my door for Slice. And, the stars kind of aligned in a different way in terms of business and the way things were going personally in life, and decided to do another startup project. So came here, met with the owners of Old Town Pizza, which is intertwined with Slice, so co-ownership.
I see what you did with the brand there.
I know, right? Really blasting it. And, we had multiple meetings around the time when I left Moonraker, and they said, we want to open a brewery and we want you to be involved and be a partner. And I couldn't really say no, because the opportunity was too good, to have, kind of back to creative freedom again and really commission the facility and kind of do things the way I wanted. So, took upon that opportunity, and, we're here now where it's at.
Oh, hell yeah. And, back to those hoppy roots. You obviously brew a lot of beers here. It's not just about hoppy beers, but that's certainly what people know you for. And it's what a lot of your peers now respect you. And I mentioned I was coming up here. It's funny how many brewers may have heard that we were going to do this. And I mean, even over the last couple of weeks, I got some emails like, oh yeah, you're going to do this podcast with Zack, because word gets out, and, people are interested. And I think people, even your peer brewers want to, kind of tap into that approach and kind of glean what they can from the way that you think about these things, because there's a lot of respect out there for you. Let's talk about some of that. Let's talk about some of those approaches to hops and to both West Coast IPA and Hazy IPA. But before we do that, supply chain challenges are here to stay for a while. So why not trust the experts to handle freight for your ingredients? Old Orchard has partnered with a leading logistics firm in the craft beverage industry to transport your craft concentrate blends. When you order 2 pails or more of concentrate from Old Orchard, you qualify for freight quotes from various carriers and can stay up to date on the status of your shipment. To get started on a freight quote for craft concentrates today, head on over to oldorchard.com/brewer. Also, looking for a good lager yeast? Fermentis is the obvious choice for beverage fermentation, and they provide brewers large and small with the most complete portfolio of dry lager yeast available anywhere. To learn more about how Fermentis can improve the quality of your fermentation, and for the latest on their exciting new product releases, visit fermentis.com. So Zack, let's talk about this. Let's dive into hops and hoppy beers. Like I said, you are crushing it on both the West Coast side and the hazy juicy side. You've got the medals to show for it on the hazy juicy side. But I see your beers show up on West Coast IPA's dead Facebook group as often as any other brewers, maybe more so, because clearly there's a love there. And you've then followed this obviously from learning, for those early knee deep days, then through Moonraker, and now here in Slice. Talk to me about that interaction between the two. Clearly, I mean, some people view these things in an oppositional way. Well, one is this, one is that. We like this or we don't like that. But you take you embrace everything here. You love both of these styles, and you take an innovative approach that moves techniques between the two, moves hop flavor between those two, and you're learning, even in both styles in a way that impacts the other style.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So, starting out as a home brewer, I got into like IPA right away. That's what I was drinking at the time. I loved hops and big aroma, and I was like veteran Racer 5 drinker and Stone IPA, and Pliny too, and Pig.
Sure,
those were like the beers back in 2008 that I was all about. And so, I wanted to mimic.
A couple of those beers you mentioned are still really good.
Oh yeah, they're great still. Nothing wrong. Yeah, those are awesome beers. But
there was some Blind Pig in the open top fermenters yesterday at Russian River, and smelling it and looking at that Kreuzen, on the open top. Oh,
it's just a beautiful thing, man.
Yeah.
So yeah, I as a home brewer, I wanted to not copycat those beers, but I wanted to create and have, I had inspiration from those beers. So I remember like going on, like homebrewtalk.com or just Googling like clones, like Lagunitas IPA clone, Racer 5 clone. And I would take all these beers, a Pliny clone, because that is like the clone of clones online. There's like so many iterations of Pliny out there. So Vinny's been very forthcoming with that recipe, which is very cool for homebrewers, especially at the time. And so
except for nobody can actually get the CTZ that he uses because no one picks it in the picking, unless you're Vinny, they don't pick it in the picking window anyway.
They can go for Simcoe too, He gets that special Simcoe.
Sure.
So anyway, looking, back then at recipes and, I wanted to create something that was, I could call it my own. So just not copying, like, not trying to clone a beer, but I'd put out maybe 4 or 5 IPAs that I was really into. And then I would take components of those recipes and develop my own, brew the beer as a home brewer, trial and error, come back, do it again. And that was really elementary days because I knew nothing about water profiles or, yeast health or anything. So, but, kind of fast forwarding a little bit, when I started really paying attention to those, fine details to how to make a good beer, besides just recipe development, you need to have, good water and treat your water the right way. You have to have good standard operating procedures and be sterile. So the thing for me was, it was all clear beer back then. I might brew a homebrew IPA and it's kind of hazy, but that was a technical flaw considerably.
Sure.
And so when I went to Knee Deep, we filtered there. We didn't only just plate and frame filter, we also DE filtered, which was like double filtration, which was intense,
Right.
And so I was taught in the production aspect that having haze was a huge flaw back in like 2010, 2011. That's like a no-no. Like you want your beer to be crystal clear. And so that was what I strived for at the time, and what I enjoyed drinking a lot, because like hazy commercial beer, I felt like if it wasn't like let's just pretend like New England IPA is not a thing, you had some kind of weird polyphenols going on in there and some weird mouthfeel. And I like it to be sharp and zippy and bright, and a polished, beer. So that's kind of the direction I was at. And then, not long after that, a year, 2 years after, between friends, like the co-owner here, Russ, was a good friend back then from home brewing. He'd get, these cans or bottles. Some of them were bottles of like, stuff from the East Coast.
Right.
And we'd try the stuff. And then like my cousin on the East Coast, he'd send me stuff. We'd do little beer trades. And it'd be the usual suspects. It was like, the Alchemist was like the first one. Heady Topper. And then it was a lot of like Hill Farmstead growlers at the time.
Right.
Try to get that growler as fresh as possible, like overnight ship it. So Hill Farm.
Overnight shipping. What, growlers of like Edward Pale Ale?
Totally, dude. Yeah. Abner and stuff like that. Yeah. So Tired Hands too, like, and then, a little bit later on, it was like Trillium and Treehouse, but it was more of those first ones that I rattled off. And I was like, this is so the opposite of what I was like taught or what I perceived just a couple years ago with like these double filtered beers. This is a totally different world, but I like it. Like this is a different presentation on hops. And, I was really interested in how you could get that amount of flavor in beer, especially for people that were not like beer drinkers. I thought it was very approachable form of IPA, So I, was, after Knee Deep, I was at the homebrew shop and Miraz, and I'm like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to start homebrewing this shit. I'm going to research it to death. I'm going to like take yeast out of the heady topper cans. I'm going to take yeast out of these tire cans. And they were like different yeast too.
Sure,
like they're behaving different. And then like reading, I think a lot of people were catching on that bug too, more and more in the forums, you're going like homebrewtalk.com. And it was like, like, can I get like a clone for like Abner or like heady topper? And so a lot of people were talking about this stuff. And, so I'm homebrewing and I'm working at Miraz, and I'd bring him into Mike at the time, and he'd go, "This is amazing beer you're making at home. This shit will not sell though. How fucking hazy this is, dude." I was like,
little did he know.
Yeah, totally. And so I got really into it. I felt like I was going in a really good direction of making these beers at home.
Sure.
From the research and water, development, because, with IPA West Coast, it was like, and it still is for us, really high sulfate, low chloride. And it's kind of a reversal on that, but still keeping it pretty soft with the haze for us. I've seen people dumping maybe more chloride than I'm comfortable with. So we keep it pretty mellow on the parts per million still on our ions.
What does mellow mean then?
It's under 100 for sure of chloride. Okay. Yeah, we're probably more in the 50 range.
Are there specific chlorides that you prefer to, that express better than others?
We like calcium because, calcium has yeast health for it too. So I've heard of other people using different chlorides. I mean, if we're gonna get the ion exchange and it's got calcium in it, why not? So we're calcium chloride, calcium sulfate. But we can go back into that, not to get too off topic. I was doing the hazy IPA thing. And then, it did really, when we started producing it commercially at Moonraker, that was kind of like when the bell started ringing. We're like, whoa, like people are really into this. This has some traction to it.
Sure.
And then it blew up, obviously. You've seen it over the years. It's just every year it's like more can options, more hazy IP options. And I mean, it's like a BA style now, for like,
it's multiple BA styles.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah. But it goes to what you were saying before, that this made it accessible because the flavors themselves and the way that they convey, it's something that people can understand. They have those connections within their own flavor and palate lexicons. And so, they can connect to those more so than just bitter.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember when I was graining out at Moonraker one time, this guy stopped me and he was like, I never liked beer or came to breweries until you, because I was like a screwdriver drinker. And it was like that orange citrus that he was into, and something with hazy IPA kind of triggered the brain and made him go, this is what I like now in terms of beer. Wasn't even a beer drinker. And I think a lot of people that was a very approachable way to get people into drinking beer, was this like, pseudo New England hazy juicy IPA thing. So, but I think, in the big picture, there's room for both. I love West Coast IPA, and I still like them crystal clear, even filtered,
Sure. Well, and the fascinating thing that we're seeing today, and one thing that you will readily admit, is that the techniques and some of the approaches developed in hazy IPA have directly impacted the development of West Coast IPA. That these things now it's harder and harder to separate those, and that whether it's whirlpool hopping techniques or late hopping techniques, whether it's driving, understanding biotransformation to push flavor, which is a completely separate thing from the haze and haze stability, on its own. All of these pieces now are, moving back and forth, and techniques are influencing style to style.
Yeah. I definitely believe there's some crossover. When I look back at like 2008 homebrew, even into like Knee Deep time commercial, and what they've turned into, like the evolution of hoppy beer, there is some crossover, I think, from the inspiration or design of hazy IPA to West Coast these days in that approachable sense. Because I'm sure you remember maybe like back in 2010, you had those like IBU wars. You remember you had like Green Flash Palette Wrecker and like Stone Ruination. And it was just like, how many BUs can you pack into this beer just to rip your face apart,
There was that McKellar beer, like 1,000 IBU IPA. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. It's all theoretical, but
all
yeah.
theoretical. And of course, not real, but great marketing.
Absolutely.
I mean, great marketing then, maybe not so great marketing now. Like 1,000 IBUs, who the fuck wants to drink that, right?
It's a different world for sure.
It is.
Yeah.
So talk to me about your, now new school current approach to West Coast IPA. What does that look like now? From the time we started the podcast to now, I've somehow finished an entire glass of your West Coast IPA. And it was absolutely delicious, clear, crisp, but also juicy, fruity, has these beautiful tropical elements to it with also a really nice structure. But there's just like a luxurious confidence to it where, it's not trying to prove anything and it's not excessive. It's pulling all of this flavor within this kind of beautiful restraint to it. Talk to me about how you are building both, the balance, but also this, expression, that doesn't have to overdo it and that pulls it all together in this tight package.
Yeah, sure. So, with kind of, we're talking about crossover, with hazy IPA, if they're done right, there's like a softness and kind of like an elegance to them. There can also be very rough and green flavors too. So with the better side of hazy IPA was the theory that I wanted to go in the direction of West Coast IPA and simplifying it. So, back, a long time ago, West Coast IPA to me was like, very strong bitterness, pretty supporting malt foundation, and very aggressive. And I think more now is that they are simplified, they're structured, they're leaner than what they used to be. And I think the hop expression is there in terms of all hop flavor and aroma and maybe less bitterness. They're still very sharp and blocky is the way I like to make them. But I think, it is more of a hop flavor aromatic experience versus just bitterness for the sake of bitterness. And supporting malt to me is good still if done right. But I would prefer to go more on the lean side in terms of drinkability and packaging sustainability. You have a beer that's got a good foundation of malt in it. That beer might rock for a week, but is it going to rock in 6 weeks or 8 weeks? Especially in the canned format. That's very competitive these days with, being on a shelf or being traded or whatever your format is in distribution of beer. So for me,
so let's dive into that. What does malt in your West Coast IPA look like? The one I had was all Pilsner malt. Are you generally just sticking to single malts, 2-row, or Pilsner, depending on what the design construction is? What does that malt base then look like for your West Coast IPAs?
Sure. So it is all Pilsner. We do use a variety of different Pilsner malts. We don't rely on one Pilsner. So
why? And what Pilsner malts?
So the one you had was raw Pils, and we like raw Pils. We feel like it's got a little bit more with pH. It got a little more acidity than the other ones. So it's a little more acidic, meaning we use less acid in the mash or adjustment. We keep the salts the same, the ions, for the profile of the beer. It's very easy to work with. Conversion's good. It laugers really good. It drops clear. So I'm not trying to plug RAR too much, but that is a very good malt for us.
I didn't put you up to that just because they sponsor the podcast. Anyway.
Yeah. We also like Gambrinus Pilsner. Cool. Super lean, really light. I think Evan from Green Cheek told me about that one, turned me on to that one.
Yeah.
And they were, we were trying some of their beers back then, and I'm like, man, these beers are so lean. And so we have certain malts with certain hops that we feel work better together than others.
What?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's just like
what?
Yeah, so like if
there's certain Pilsner malt that works better with certain hops.
Yeah,
you got to tell me about that.
So I mean, like back to the Gambrinus thing, it's extremely lean, right?
Okay.
And the shelf stability on our Gambrinus beers are pretty amazing. I could crack a can like most of the time 2.5-3 months later, and it's tasting pretty bright still. And so for us, we have a series of they're all like New Zealand hop beers. So it's usually a single New Zealand hop, but we've done one recently where we blend them all. So it's called our blinding series. We have like a blinding sunrise, blinding sunset, blinding sunlight, and then the last one was blinding moonlight, where they're all blended. So there's something with like Nelson and a very lean canvas that just like works really well together versus having a bunch of malt in there. I'm not sure. And not like other Pilsner malts have a bunch of malt, but RAR and some other ones that I could rattle off, they do have a little bit more shoulders to them than like Gambrinas. So Gambrinas, to me, it can almost be maybe too lean for like a competition beer. Like a judge might knock it.
Right.
Like literally we got knocked at World Cup and GABF for some of our beers. They're like, this is like Pilsner level, like beer. Like this is like a lager. I love it because it rocks. It rips for the hops, and it's a good showcase for like this New Zealand character. We've done it with like Pacific Northwest hops, and it doesn't quite pop the same way. I don't know how to explain it. So
Interesting.
Just trial and error, So, yeah. With the New Zealand hops, Nelson, Rawaka, Nectaron, those were like the 3 single ones we did in the series, and then the last one we blended all those together, and it rips,
You have any of that on tap? Because I'm going to have to try some of that if you have anything left.
I don't, man.
Crushed.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah. And we've done it. We've done like that with like Mosaic too, like 100% Mosaic beer. And it does really good too. But something with New Zealand, and I don't know if that's maybe something from like the old school, like Alpine Nelson, it was just like this like Nelson kind of showcase with like a pretty simple, malt profile. But like West Coast kind of like really crystal clear version in that aspect. So that was something. So
are those the 2 kind of Pilsner malts that you tend to use, or is there anything else there that hits your malt base for these?
Well, those are workhorse. We recently brought in CMC Superior Pils, Canadian Malting Company. We used that in our Beechwood collab. So Shrego, he kind of turned us on to that for our double, and then we rocked it in a couple singles and a couple more doubles. And that's another rad malt too. Nice conversion, Lauder's really good. But that and
the
RAR,
Shrego guy knows a thing or two.
A little bit. Yeah. That CMC and the RAR, they definitely have more body and shoulders than like Gambrinas does. So I think there's like a place for these malts with hops, or kind of the vision of the way you want the beer to turn out, versus just having a silo of, your 100% 2-row or Pilsner malt, and you just run every beer that way. We could, and they probably turn out still pretty good. But I think they're a little bit better based off the vision of what you're going to have with these hops and malt, how they balance out. So.
Do you use all Pilsner malt then in your West Coast IPAs, or do you ever duck into some 2-row?
So I'll rewind a little bit. So back at Moonraker, we did like a lot of different things. It was like 2-row, it was like Pilsner, it was like we'll splash in some Munich, some Vienna, Crystal, Carafoam.
Throwback.
Totally. But you know what? Those beers were still pretty lean. And so some of the curve here, when I commissioned slices, back at Moonraker, we had steam facility, on our burner. It was a steam brew house, both facilities that I commissioned there. Here it's a direct fire, and it rips. So it really wants to caramelize more than a steam system would. So when I first did the first beers here, they did have some of those components that those old recipes had in them.
Right. There
was some crystal malt in the IPAs. There was a little bit of Munich. There was 2-row base. And I'm drinking these beers, and I'm like, they're good for a couple weeks, but they're falling off a cliff pretty fast,
Yeah.
And a lot of it, is like some of that crystal malt you get from like the UK, it's already oxidized. It's like oxidized malt. So you're already at a disadvantage when you put it in your beer from day one. You're like mashing in like oxidation, and then you couple that with like real oxidation, like, like high, like maybe, we never had any issues with TPO or like DO, but, but still it's there.
And then some Maillard reaction from a direct fire kettle on top of that.
Totally, man. You throw in like some Munich malt and rock a 90-minute boil. You're just, asking for, some kind of a component of sweetness and being it malt driven versus hop driven. And so trying these beers, as I kept brewing them, I'm like liking them more and more as I'm taking out malt, and just kind of like, hey, let's scrap this. Oh, I'm liking it more. Hey, let's cut this back. I'm liking it more. And so we've just settled on this kind of array of Pilsner malts now that kind of work for us. We'll still use some 2-row, but like it's crazy. If we did the same beer that was 100% raw 2-row versus like Gambrinus pills or even raw pills, they're like different worlds, you know? So we still dig 2-row, but we might even blend it with Pilsner sometimes. It's kind of just the vision of what we want the beer to be as an end result. If we want like a little bit more body or character with the certain hop varieties, or if it's a collab, you know, we're receptive to kind of using some stuff that's kind of out of our wheelhouse. So,
well, let's talk about hops themselves, because here, you know, especially within that scope of West Coast IPA. But before we do that, of course, you all love podcasts. You're listening to this one right now. If you're interested in another podcast that's going to give you some great information on ingredients and usage and everything else, check out the Brew Deck podcast from our friends at Country Malt Group. It's pretty cool. They cover topics from selecting and sourcing raw materials to innovative new products, entertaining stories, and insights. The Brew Deck podcast is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe today. And if you're looking for it on something like Apple Podcasts, just look for Country Malt Group, because that'll show it up for you. Also, Arrived Mobile Point of Sale powers places with personality. Arrived is streamlining business operations for the makers of craft with an all-in-one solution that was built with love by hospitality professionals. No contracts and no monthly fees make Arrived a no-brainer for your craft business. Go to arrived.com/CBB to set up a free customized demo. That's Arrived, ARRYVED.com/CBB. A different kind of POS has arrived. So, Zach, let's dive into hops. Clearly, this is a subject that you're deeply engaged in. You know, and you work across a spectrum of hops, you know, from American hops to New Zealand hops to interesting blends of old and new school hops, which seem to be driving some creativity for you. Talk to me about, you know, some of the different buckets that you might put your hoppy beers into in terms of blends, approaches that create this kind of range to your hoppy offerings.
So with our IPAs, and if we're talking West Coast IPA, we do like to structure those beers to be pretty assertive still. But we have cut back to what our IPAs were, or at least the way I was brewing them 5-10 years ago. And so
what does that mean?
So in terms of BUs, they're a lot less than what we were calculating early on.
Oh, yeah? Like, what's a typical goal?
And
obviously, there's going to be some range here depending on other...
Right. And so I think it's a variety specific to what the recipe design would be, meaning if we were going to do a single hop beer and it was all mosaic, I would treat that beer a lot different than if it was all Chinook or like 100% Centennial, based off studying the oil components of what those hops are. Like the C hops are very high in cohumulone. And so they give a lot more of an assertive bite to what you might get in a beer versus something like Citra, which is low cohumulone and, you know, just a different oil composition, or Simcoe, you know, is really soft too. You're going to get different components in terms of bitterness and overall flavor based off different hop varieties.
So IBU isn't IBU. IBU has some other influencing factors in terms of how people perceive it.
Right. So I could never take the same recipe if I was going to, like, say, you know, like I said, do one hop variety versus another. I think it all depends on what that hop is. So a good, you know...
and so for something that's more assertive, like a classic C hop, you would actually shoot for a slightly lower IBU, lower hop load, just because you know that that's going to present as more biting.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So we cut back, at least on the kettle side for sure. And maybe even the dry hop too a little bit. Of that hop variety, or just, you know, it's a balancing act. You got to kind of have the vision and figure out what direction it's going to go, because you don't want it to be too sweet, you don't want it to be too assertive. So you really want to meet in the middle and try to get all that hop flavor and aroma that you're shooting for.
Do you have a formula for this, or is this just basically, you know, kind of a shoot from the hip? You know, and as you're developing the recipe, you can visualize it.
I think just you know, commissioning the system and really getting close with the way that these beers taste, you know, from a sensory perspective, and really sitting down and kind of being honest with yourself, like, is this something that I'd be really stoked on if someone else made it, you know?
Sure.
You know, like, I know this is my beer, and, you know, it's tough to like not love your own kids, but you have to really say, like, would I be pumped if this was my beer, or if this was someone else's beer? And so you kind of go work backwards. You know, you brew, and then you say, okay, maybe this is not the direction I want the beer to be in terms of the malt too, or the hop character. And so,
in a pragmatic sense, then, like, what does that range look like? You know, if you're trying to shoot for a similar end goal, you know, where would that C hop be in terms of planned IBU, calculated IBUs versus, you know, a Mosaic or a Simcoe?
Sure. So I can give you a spectrum. Is that typically most of the beers are falling for single IPA in the 40 to 60 range of like a calculated IBU. You know,
but that's still a 20 IBU range there between the top and the bottom.
Pretty big swing. So,
right.
So, you know, if we were going to use C hops, you know, it might be in the kettle, you know, maybe 10 to 15% of the hopping, and then the other, you know, remaining, you know, 85, 90% would be built up around other hop varieties. So just to give a little bit of bite in there, and it would typically be in the whirlpool. And then in the dry hop, you know, I'm not afraid to split it in, but I usually keep it at about a quarter of the dry hop of a C hop. So if that was like Columbus or Chinook, or Centennial, or Cascade, any of those standard C hops. The thing that we really like about, you know, like the C hops for us blending with the sexies is it definitely keeps
with the sexies. Hey,
you know what I'm talking about.
I do.
It seems to keep that aroma hanging around a long time. Yeah. Like something about putting Columbus in with like Citra, Simcoe, Mosaic really holds on to those three other good hops. While sometimes, you know, those hops are so high impact early on fresh, but they kind of start to curve downhill after a while. But you throw a little Chinook in there, or Columbus, it kind of brightens them all up and keeps them alive for a while.
Gives them longevity in the package.
Absolutely, yeah. And you know, I've only talked to a few brewers about this kind of theory, but I know brewers that already kind of do that. They formulate that with their recipes, and you can tell. You try the beers, and you're like, man, this beer still rips. You know, it's like 8 weeks old and it smells like it's like a week old, you know, it's still hanging on because it's got maybe something in there more than just Citra, you know?
Right.
So
what do you think it is about those C hops that lends it that kind of longevity and helps it kind of, you know, improve that long-term brightness?
I think it just comes down to the oil composition of what those hops are built around. Cause they look a lot different on paper than like some of the, you know, the like Citrus, Simcoe, Mosaic.
Right.
And specifically that we see it, without like getting too deep into the oil content, is the cohumulone's pretty high. And so it's something to do with maybe that, and, you know, pairing it up with another hop. You know, I'm not smart enough to know hops from a scientific perspective. Got to talk like Matt Brendelson or something.
Sure.
But we've just seen it from trial and error.
Right,
you know?
right. If it works, it works.
Absolutely. And that doesn't mean that we won't rock, you know, like an all Mosaic beer, or, you know, just do all the sexy hops, or, you know, one thing that we do see too, kind of in that same wheelhouse, but different, is pairing like New Zealand hops with like American hops that give you this really awesome complexity and kind of some longevity in different kinds of profiles.
What would a blend look like for that, you know, typically speaking, or not if there's anything typical, but
yeah. I could tell you one that recent in my mind that we were really stoked on was we did a collab with Ghost Town out in Oakland. Those guys are making awesome West Coast hoppy beer. It was Nelson, and like really good Nelson too. So all the hop, you know, varieties on a rattle off, they all came from people that are just crushing, you know, the hop game. So it was like Nelson from Freestyle. The Rawaka came from Hop Revolution, actually, and it was just amazing Rawaka. And then it was Mosaic, which I can't remember the farm, but the Simcoe Cryo was Peralt. And so it was like, you know, Simcoe, Mosaic were like our two Pacific Northwest hops, and then Nelson, Rawaka. And that combination was just this awesome synergy of, you know, complexity with, you know, tropical, but like dank. And then you get like that New Zealand, you know, kind of stink going on. You know, we were cracking cans of that pretty late too, like 7-8 week old cans, and they were ripping still.
Yeah.
So some kind of, you blend like the New Zealands with the, Pacific Northwest stuff is kind of like blending some of the sea hops with like the sexies, you get this kind of different complexity.
Now, what do general ratios look like? When you're blending these sea hops with your sexy or Citra or whatnot.
Yeah.
What's the point at which they start to make a difference?
So we'll usually pick like 2. I guess it depends on what the recipe is, but so that was 4 hops in that Ghost Town collab. We did just Mosaic and Simcoe just for the kettle and whirlpool, just to kind of simplify it. And then we just, really piled in the dry hop with those other 4 varieties. And those were split 4 ways evenly. So it was, to make it simple, it was a 4.4 pound per barrel dry hop of 1.1 of each variety. Yeah.
And do a 10 barrel system or?
We do have a 10 barrel direct fire system, and we have 20 barrel fermenters. So we have 6 20s, and ended up being 4.4 pound per barrel dry hop for that beer.
Somehow cleverly aligns with package bag size and everything else. Go figure.
That's the formula.
Right, right.
We don't have to have open bags around. No, we don't do that anymore unless we have to.
Right.
For the kettle hops, no big deal. But for the dry hops, it's always fresh bags. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Now you all are now large enough to select some hops, right? Or at least maybe if not large enough. What's the volume these days?
I think you still have to hit 500 pounds per variety. And so we could do group selection. We haven't done that yet for our we're contracted with YCH for our main hops, but we got, we're paired with Freestyle for Nelson. And I think Future Rawaka we're on for like 2023, where we get Rawaka with Freestyle. We have Rawaka and Nectar on through NZ Hops, which I should reach out. I don't know if we can select with them. And then we get Strata from Indy, which they've always been every year very cool on selection.
So you're still making a lot of these beers with hops that are not necessarily selected hops that, and they're delicious and award-winning beers, even, which is a fascinating thing to me. Obviously, most professional brewers talk about selection, very key factor in the way they make great beers. But then you've got folks like, Burke Gilman who come along and absolutely crush it with no selected hops because they're never going to be big enough to do that kind of thing.
Right.
Selection alone is not necessarily the key to success here. It's certainly a good thing. I mean, most brewers love that having that extra level of control. Talk to me about how you take some of these hops that are not necessarily selected hops and maximize the expression of those.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll say all around, it seems like quality's gone up significantly in the past years with most hop manufacturers are just the level is high. So with our main hops from YCH, we are contracted, but we do not select because we don't hit that volume.
Right.
And then we do select with we selected this year Freestyle Nelson, and then we select Strata every year. They're cool enough to where both of those, Freestyle and Indy, where we're under 500 and they'll let us select anytime. So
you win a few medals, sometimes the hop companies will bend the rules for you that way.
Well, I also wrote big contracts for that other brewery before too with selection. So that might have some kind of pull. So, but anyway, we'll get stuff on the table and we'll select, and it's crazy how, you think something, or at least you select, and then you get it later on and you're like, wow, this is not what I thought I rubbed or smelled on the table that one day. Like, are these guys messing with me? Is this the same lot? Which I'm confident it is the same lot.
Right.
But it's funny how just things change during the pelletizing process or your own sensory.
Your own sensory for sure.
Like did I have a breakfast burrito and all of a sudden I'm doing selection and I got this hot sauce in my olfactory senses.
I see that all the time because I'll taste a beer in one scenario and then come back a week later and try it, and I mean my body chemistry changes even in that short amount of time. If I've gone for a mountain bike ride earlier, that'll change the way that I even taste things. It's funny, the more you get into this, the more you become distrustful of your own sensory system, which is It's kind of a weird thing to.
Totally. No, I mean, we get surprised all the time,
Yeah.
you know? And even like we did, for Freestyle Nelson, we did kind of like a little group with Moxa, you know, this year, just a few weeks ago. And we had a bunch
They're the number 2 brewery in Rockland County, right?
like in Rock, or Placer County, Placer.
Oh, Placer County. Right.
Yeah.
No, Derek.
Number
was,
1 in Rockland. Yeah.
Derek was talking about, I was like, you know, we would be the number 1 brewery here if it weren't for Slice.
Oh, really? I'm gonna have to give me shit about that.
Hey.
Anyway, we put a bunch of Nelson on the table, and interesting enough, we did all kind of come to a consensus of agreement.
Right.
Even though we weren't contracted together for a group, you know, buy-in, we were on separate playing fields. We did selection together just because it'd be fun.
Sure.
And so we did both kind of randomly pick the same lot, but all the Nelson on the table was really good. Nothing was bad at all. But you could see how someone might say, you know, like, man, this one's just a diesel bomb. Like, or this one just is muted, you know? And so, yeah, you know, what did I have for like lunch before I went to Moxie? You know, what triggered me to pick that lot? Who knows? You know what I mean? Maybe if it would have been a different day or time, or I had something else to eat that day, I might have said, hey, I like
sure.
lot 5, you know, this lot instead of that lot. So, you know, we are kind of at a disadvantage with, and I don't even know if it's a disadvantage, but not being able to select our main hops, like our Simcoe Citra Mosaic. I do feel that the quality all around is very good of what we get. My new like trick now, this is my own thing that I do, is I'll collab with people or go to other breweries and I'll smell whatever they got. And I'm like, man, you got some ripping Citra. Let me check out that lot number. And since we're contracted, I can always request that lot number still. And so I'll just hit up YCH and say, hey, you have this lot? Like, we want this. And most of the time lately, we've been scoring it. I know that's like an old cellar maker thing too, is they would just find these like lots and then just like throw a bunch of money at YCH and be like, give us all this Simcoe lot. We don't want anything else. So I've kind of been like doing that lately.
Just find those breweries that are large enough to select. Do those collabs, and then piggyback it.
Yeah. So that's kind of our thing.
That's a smart strategy.
Yeah.
My God.
Yeah. We'll collab, or we'll be at a brewery and see what they got, and then I take down the lot number, and if we're stoked on whatever, and just hit up YCH and say, hey, do you got this? And we've been scoring a little bit this year, so yeah, that's kind of our thing with the hops.
Cool. Are there any budding hops that you've been playing around with lately that have really been driving some stoke for you?
Yeah. So I think Nectaron last year, when that first was kind of getting hot, I think it was maybe even a couple years ago, but we contracted it last year, and we didn't select, but we just got what we got. I think actually it was maybe even spot back then, but we ended up doing, like part of that single hop New Zealand series.
Right. I
think that one was called Blinding Sunset with 100% Nectaron. And that beer with that hop was just ripping. That was like that Gambrinus Pilsner, like lean, just all Nectaron. And it was like a really good lot of Nectaron.
Anybody who listens to that old podcast, the podcast I did with Stan Hieronymus when he was talking about Nectaron, some brewers, immediately contracted or bought Nectaron following that, and have told me about that. It was funny to see just the ripples out from that kind of thing.
Oh yeah, we didn't. We were one of them to spot though. We listened to that and we were like, "What's this like?" Because like New Zealand hops, because like around here we're big. Like Nelson.
Jude from Hop Butcher did the same. He's like, we went and bought some Nectaron immediately as soon as we heard that. Like, that's cool. I mean, there it is.
Yeah.
Stan is a national treasure.
That's awesome. Yeah. We literally like listened to that, and we're big fans of like Nelson and Rawaka,
sure,
and have been for I think literally since Alpine Nelson like came out. We've
absolutely
so much about that hop and New Zealand hops in general. And so when we heard that and just the kind of promotion of that hop, we were like, oh man, you're really reeling me in right to buy this hop. So. And we just spotted it. We gave it a shot, and we used it in haze actually at first just to kind of test it, because I feel like the expression of haze is so much more yeast driven versus West Coast can really show what that hop's about. So we actually did it in haze to kind of just see what it would like turn out like, and we were so surprised on how aromatic that hop was in haze versus being yeast driven. And so then we had that same, spot allotment that we still had, inventory of, and we gave it a shot on just a West Coast, and it rips. So Nectaron's,
Nectaron and West Coast IPA, huh?
Nectaron's on the radar for haze too.
Sure.
And new hops, I think 586 is starting to kind of create some waves. I'm surprised it doesn't have a name yet. We were using it a couple years ago. It's changed it a little bit. And now I see it in the cryo for them. We did a collab with Ghost Town at their spot, and it had some 586 cryo, and I was screaming pretty loud. Very unique hop qualities, different than like your standard, qualities you get out of like the sexies. What else? I'm not sure. I kind of auto-tune back to some of the old school hops too still,
Fair enough.
Can't forget about those C hops.
Let's talk about your hazy brewing strategy. Obviously we've talked about West Coast a lot here. Now we've talked about hops, all very, very cool stuff. Let's talk about building a base for that hop expression within a hazy beer and building a kind of stable haze out of that. What is, what's a kind of a grist base then look, within your hazy beer program?
Yeah, sure. So,
you have won a few medals of this, between all of the major competitions. So we should probably talk about that and not just West Coast IPA.
Hey, fair enough. Yeah. So, Pilsner again too is kind of the back to the, that's our standard.
Keeping it light and bright.
Keep it light. I did used to use a lot of other boutique base malts, which I still like a lot. The Thomas Fawcett lineup. They make just some amazing malt. It's really characterful malt that presents a lot of good qualities. But we do like the lean quality too. So we do still use some Thomas Fawcett malts here and there. But our core, for our haze is Pilsner, and we're big on Environment for that versus like the Gambrinas and the RAR.
Environment Pills for hazy IPA.
Dude.
What?
Yeah, I know. Mind blowing.
How did you get to that?
Something with the protein makeup. It behaves a little bit different than the other ones do. So, and we've tried the other ones in haze, and we default back to that. So. Environment.
Well, it's a great crossover because you're also making Hellas and other lagers here too, and so you get some dual purpose out of it.
Yeah. That one's got Barca in it. I think that's the way you pronounce it. Barca. Yeah,
Barca. Yeah,
100% that one. So yeah. Anyway, we really like Environment. Especially like for the lagers too. But for haze, that's kind of our go-to. But like I said, we like Thomas Fawcett still, and we'll feather in sometimes some of their malts. But so typically Environment base, and then it's usually around the 70 to 80% range. And then the makeup is usually, some type of an adjunct or flaked malt.
Right.
So any kind of combination of
wheat oats.
Exactly. It's kind of the standard these days,
Sure.
So malted oats, flaked oats.
But 20 to 30% even.
Yeah. So about
That's pretty significant.
It's a hefty amount.
Yeah.
So unmalted wheat, flaked wheat, malted oats, flaked oats, spelt, chit, some of those. Just kind of depends on the vision that we have of the beer, or what we're looking to achieve. And also if it's a collab, we like to try new stuff that other people are doing that we're not doing. So we also use a little bit of carafoam for some body. So we're like in the 3 to 5% range for our standard, just to really give like that, mouthfeel body perception. So that's the base. We do treat our hazy IPA different with the water profile than we do West Coast. So we go high on the sulfate, low on the chloride for the West Coast to get it, really sharp and blocky. And we do go, it's kind of like a flip. It's like a 2-to-1 ratio of chloride to sulfate, but it's very low still.
2-to-1.
Yeah, you have chloride to sulfate of those ions, with calcium being the exchange ion, just to build up. So, but everything is typically under 100 parts per million. I've been to other breweries and talked to a lot of people that are making, these hazy IPAs for years, and they're dumping in just tons of these ions, and that's fine. And a lot of these people make really good beer too. And I try it, and I would never even know. But just for my personal sensory, I think coming back from homebrewing I used to do these trial and error things with just pushing the boundaries on, these ion exchanges, and just going through the roof on sulfate or going through the roof on chloride. And the fact is, chloride is a pretty nasty tasting ion on itself. If you just dump it in water and taste it at like a pretty high, parts per million, it tastes gross, dude. Like, so I just think about that in the full presentation of the beer. And so we keep it really soft still all around.
And I can see that, the ratio is one thing, but that total dissolved solids level is actually, it's significant in lager, but it's interesting to think that is also significant in something like Hazy IPA. And certainly when we are getting at it from a sensory perspective, you can taste the chalkiness, that kind of drying chalkiness that comes with this really intense mineral, component to it. Right. And keeping that low allows some of those juicier flavors and some of those maltier flavors to push forward.
I think just the beer in general. You want to taste all those raw material components of the beer. And we have really just beautiful water up here, in Lincoln. This whole Placer County area, you're getting like the snow runoff from Tahoe. So it's really soft. If you look at it on paper, it looks like RO water. For us, everything's under 20 parts. So
that's great.
Alkalinity hits like 18. That's like the highest thing, and we get water tests every 6 months to make sure that, everything's pretty consistent. And we'll see little spikes, around this time of year because things are starting to melt up on the mountain. The water changes. I know like in pockets of Rockland, they'll change to like the city to well water sometimes. Like they'll flip them back and forth, like change the valves. So there's that would make me a little worrisome on consistency, but for us in Lincoln, we're hitting the same water every time. So it's soft, and I like to keep it soft and just get, those ions in there for a little bit of complexity, but also some calcium, so both, calcium sulfate and calcium chloride have, that ion attached to it. So get enough calcium in for the yeast health. And, the yeast strains that we do use for Hazy IPA can, have trouble sometimes with attenuation, and we strive for, a good attenuation and healthy fermentation with the beer. So, I think, water is a component, to making these beers, but having, just a very well-structured beer and healthy fermentation is key too.
What does healthy fermentation look like for your Hazy IPA?
Yeah. So,
and what do you ferment with, obviously, in the process?
Yeah, sure. So, the one thing that West Coast IPA and Hazy IPA have in common is we do mash these beers very low. So we want to encourage, attenuation.
Even in the Hazy IPA.
Even in Hazy IPA. We are adding in, these bodybuilding malts like carafoam, and wheat and oats and stuff. And so, we want, with what we see with these yeast strains that we use, they finish high by design. It's not like, our West Coast IPA beers finish at like 1.5 to 2 Plato. It's pretty common for these hazies, like the singles to finish around the 3.5 range, and the doubles like the 4.5 to 5 range sometimes. That's like a lot of residual sugar. So we encourage them to ferment healthy and get done. So
yeah, the yeast is going to leave enough sweetness in there. You don't need to amplify that with your mash strategy.
Right. So mash low, pitch enough oxygen at knockout, and just pitch enough healthy cells, And I think a lot of it, comes to just our standard operating procedures too. The way that we CIP things, like our heat exchanger, we go through methods that are a little bit different than other people. A lot of people, I say, well, like, what do you do your heat X? We just hot kill it is what they say. Well, that's cool that, it's sterile enough, but, a lot of things can live in there too. So, I think just having a good regimen of the way that we make.
What do you do then?
So we do, our standard SOP for like the heat X is like caustic both ways, and then we'll flush that with hot water. Then we'll do like a nitric phosphoric acid blend. We'll CIP that in a loop, and then we'll push that with cold water, and then we'll pack it with PA, parasitic acid, and then we'll push the parasitic acid out with wort, and then we'll valve in to the tank when we're knocking out into the fermenter. Meanwhile, when we're valving off into the fermenter that is connected to a T that's been looped in through our CIP on the heat X, that is our yeast line. And that's usually connected to our brink, and we dose our brink with our yeast and our enzymes at the time too. So it's just kind of like the formula that we've done. That's just one little small piece, though. I guess I meant in a broader perspective of just how the way that we make our beer too has a big impact versus, you know, you can mash low and, you know, pitch enough yeast and run enough oxygen, but how sterile is your brewery? You know what I mean? So. I always like tell people, you know, I'd eat like my dinner off the floor of my brewery, of how clean it is. You
Sure,
know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah. No, these are all of a piece. You know, when it comes to fermentation, you know, are you in the London Ale 3 family for your, you know, for your hazy IPAs?
So we are London 3, but we do use different yeast suppliers a lot.
Really?
Yeah. So we don't rely on like one house strain,
right?
And it's kind of like how I was mentioning with West Coast IPA, you know, and the New Zealand and Gambrinus combo, you know, New Zealand hops and Gambrinus malt. There's like a vision that you have for maybe this beer. It's kind of the same way with hazy IPA. I might want to use, you know, a yeast that's producing more thiol precursor with like New Zealand hops versus like maybe just London yeast, or like we still like Vermont yeast a lot too, like Barbarian Vermont.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we'll blend them, you know. You know, my fiance, she's a brewer too, and we like collabed back in the day, and we used to blend like Vermont and London 50-50, and some of those beers came out rad, you know, and I did it back at Moonraker and done it here a few times, and you would never know, you know, I could tell you it's all London and you might not know, but there's some complexities there. Or just using.
What do you get from blending?
So what we see, we'll differentiate them. What we get from Vermont on its own is better attenuation. You know, they're kind of behaving kind of like Cal Ale to some degree, maybe a little bit higher. And what we see is a lot more hop aroma versus like London is just yeast driven all the way. You know, it's very sweet smelling almost, which can be good. You know, I mean, people want that character, and we dig it too. You know, but it goes back to, you know, what hops are you using in the dry hop? You know, what's the grist looking like? You know, what's this beer finishing at?
Sure,
you know?
sure.
What generation is that yeast on now? You know, we talking a fresh pitch, we talking like a Gen 10, you know, because it's going to behave differently. So with Vermont or Barbarian, we get more attenuation, more hop aroma. With London, we're getting, you know, poor attenuation, but maybe more fuller mouthfeel, maybe a softer character, which is nice for the style. It's very soft, almost kind of like airy quality, you know, on the palate. And then, you know, and then very estery too, you know, in the yeast profile. So when you blend them, you kind of get two different worlds, you know what I mean? And if it's done right, we see a little bit better attenuation than if it was not just London.
Right.
And then maybe a little bit better hop expression too on the aroma.
You repitch these blends, or is that just basically a one and done to make sure that the balance is right?
We have done multi-gens. The blend, for some reason, they want to drop clear. I'm not sure.
It's interesting.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. There's some kind of weird stratification going on. And then sometimes you wonder what you're actually getting in a brink. You know, like maybe that London's hanging out up in high suspense and the Vermont's dropped to the cone and now you're running just Vermont. We don't have an extensive lab, so we don't know what we're really running. So we just kind of, you know, we roll with it and, you know, make sure everything's sterile, obviously. I mean, we have SOPs that I feel like we are production brewing, but we're like in a pub brewing environment, if that makes sense.
Sure.
You know?
No, there's a level of nerdiness to this, clearly, that I've gotten from our conversation so far that belies your size. Sure.
Totally.
Let's zoom out for a minute and talk about, you know, just the idea of excellence. Zach, what do you think are some of those, you know, clearly you've made a mark as a brewer. Clearly you've been winning some awards for what you do. What do you think are those key factors that differentiate some of the beers that you're making, you know, from the kind of general, you know, midstream of both of West Coast and hazy IPA styles?
Sure.
What are those key factors that take beers from good to great?
I think, you know, having just as much as you can at this capacity, a strong QA/QC program. So, you know, unfortunately, we don't have an extensive lab. You know, we're doing, you know, like under 1,500 barrels a year. You know, so we're a tiny brewery.
Sure.
I felt like I learned pretty strong SOPs early on and kind of kept those, and not just kind of got set in my ways, but always redeveloping to make sure that our process is sound. The one, positive thing is since we're so small here, it's just me brewing still, and I have one assistant. And so when you only have two people, there's not a lot of cooks in the kitchen for things to go wrong. And if things do go wrong, there's only one finger you can point. It's either at yourself or the other person. So
the communication chain is really short on that.
Right. And so when you see some of these breweries, nothing against large production breweries, but there's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of valves being turned. There's a lot of mechanisms happening. There's a lot of mistakes happening. And, I think our, process here that makes it sound is just knowing that it's a tight crew, and keeping strong on our operating procedures, and kind of just being honest with yourself. If something isn't right, send it down the drain, or reevaluate what's really going on here and do something better next time. But it is a common thing that you see some of these people that have some success on the smaller scale, like those guys, that won like Alpha King, and they won like GABF, they're pretty tiny, and you have a small crew, and communication's open and it's key. And, you can really focus on what's going on, versus having just this monster manufacturing plant, and things are happening that you don't even know about sometimes. You know what I mean?
Which actually makes those larger scale breweries that are able to accomplish that and focus on quality, it makes what they do even more impressive, to be able to corral that kind of large scale, and all of those multi impacts also. Both of those things are it's actually even just as fascinating.
Oh, absolutely.
To see how they pull that together.
No, for sure. I wasn't trying to talk bad about.
Oh, no. But you're right. There are breweries that get large and lose sight of what they were doing, and there are breweries that get large and continue to execute at a very high level. And it's even harder to execute at that highest level.
There's a part of me, I'm just jealous I don't have some of those toys those guys have,
Sure.
So, they do have the luxury, with the big production to kind of really look at things that I can't even see with my beer. So,
right.
Yeah.
Well, Zach, what's the big picture for Slice? What do you guys hope to achieve with this business? What do you, in 5 years from now, what are you going to be bragging about? What do you hope to have accomplished in that time?
Right now, we're sustainable, and, we're still, I guess, technically in COVID, but we were open for 3.5 months, and then COVID knocked on our door and we had to shut our doors. So we were a to-go, operation, solid for a year, no tasting room open. And we're open now, and things are getting back to normal.
It is a small tasting room.
It is, man.
It's a very cozy, small tasting room.
It is, I know. So the one thing that I like to see is just to expand some space. We're looking out at where you parked your car. We're going to try to get a patio out there, and not a temporary, like a permanent. So we're working with the city right now to put a permanent structure out there that will take over all those parking spaces in the front. So pretty good amount of space.
I'll happily give up some parking space for more space to drink your beer.
Absolutely, yeah. And then, as far as expansion plans, we're in a really good zone right now because it's just me and one assistant on the production side. We have a small tasting room. The way we're selling beer, we're profitable and we're in a good margin. That's something that's kind of tough to walk away from too, because things are going good.
Right.
Could they be better? Maybe not. I don't know. So, but that doesn't mean that the doors aren't open for some kind of expansion potential in the future. So, we are talking, myself and the other co-owners about opportunities. And, maybe looking at a bigger brew house or producing more. We'll see what happens.
Well, these beers are delicious, and so it would be certainly justified. And I think that is a great place to bring this to a close. G&D's micro-channel condensers are highly efficient in hotter regions. ProBrew has the equipment, systems, and technology to take your brewing to the next level. Get reliable supply for your fruit beers with Old Orchard's craft concentrate blends. Fermentis provides brewers large and small with the most complete portfolio of dry lager yeast available anywhere. Listen and subscribe to the Brew Deck podcast from Country Malt Group and Arrived mobile point of sale powers places with personality. As always, your magazine subscription supports our ability to bring you this podcast each week. Go to beerandbrewing.com, click on the subscribe button. Let us know this content matters to you. It's the reason that I can come out and have these great conversations face to face and, with folks like Zack and others. Zack, if people want to learn more about Slice, where do they find you all, both in real life and out there on the interwebs?
So the standard social media, Facebook, Instagram. And then we're located in downtown Lincoln on 6th Street. And we're right next to Old Town Pizza on the corner. So pizza and beer right next to each other. Come downtown Lincoln and hang out.
What a great mix. The beers are transcendent. Everyone seek them out. Trade if you have to, but coming out here and drinking them fresh at the location is the best possible place to do it. Zack, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Oh, thanks, Jamie. Appreciate it.
Yeah, cheers.
Yeah, cheers.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.